Mr. President, Dean Pearson, members of the administration, members of the Founders Day Committee, members of the faculty, staff, friends, and most important, students, good morning and happy Founders Day 2020. Mercer has reached the ripe old age of 187. I would like to thank the student committee and others responsible for the invitation to be your speaker today. It's always a joy to return to this campus, to observe all the growth, the changes, improvements, and to reminisce, but especially to interact with bright students like you who are benefiting from the fine, quality education Mercer offers. I grew up in the tiny town of Bradley, Georgia, some would say Hamlet, next door in Jones County. In my community, most African Americans lived on small plots of land that they owned and farmed, or as sharecroppers, farming land owned by others. During my earliest years, few had electricity and most lacked indoor plumbing. As were the neighborhoods, the public schools were segregated. Although the United States Supreme Court's decision in Brown was issued in 1954, I was unaware of it when I entered school in 1955. I entered the first grade in a new building, the result of the all too belated attempt by responsible officials to demonstrate that separate but equal was effectively in place. No one in my family had previously finished high school or elementary school for that matter. My mother, for example, had access to education only through the 5th grade. Notwithstanding her limited formal education, my mother was an avid reader throughout her almost 95 years. She was a stern advocate for education and simply did not abide or tolerate laxity when it came to study and homework. She consistently engaged my teachers, and she, as most of us, encouraged all of us to finish high school. More and more of us, black students of the racially turbulent 60s and 50s, decided not only that we wanted to finish high school, but to go on to college. On one occasion when I was a child, around 4 or 5, we traveled to Macon. Now, coming to Macon from Bradley was like going to Atlanta today. We had the occasion to be on College Street, and I observed a very large building topped with several of what I thought to be steeples. The only buildings I had ever seen with steeples were churches. I asked my mother, "What church is that?" She responded that it was not a church. It was Mercer University, a college. She explained that college was where high school students or graduates went to further their education so that they could become teachers and such. With glee and excitement, I exclaimed, "I'm going to Mercer." She said, "Okay." The building I had observed, of course, was the administration building next door. This was the Deep South, racially segregated, and we lived in poverty. It was a time before the confrontations and events of the modern civil rights movement. Years later, my high school counselor told me that Mercer was recruiting African American students qualified to attend Mercer. She told the recruiters that I was qualified, and she told me that I would apply. I did, and I was accepted and received the scholarship. My fervent prayers for the means to attend college had been answered. I was among 20 similarly situated African American students who entered Mercer in the fall of the year that Sam Oney, the first African American resident student admitted, was graduated, 1967. Mercer was then 134 years old and was welcoming only her fourth class that included African Americans. We were only a small percentage of the student body. We all knew about the refusal the year before to admit Sam Oney to worship service next door at what was then Tatnall Square Baptist Church. However, we stood ready to get about beginning and building our path to careers and opportunities that we believe the Mercer education would provide. For me and my classmates, for many of them, that was our first exposure to a racially integrated institution of learning. There was faculty and staff who were sensitive to our circumstances and needs, were supportive, and offered counsel. Foremost among them was Dean Joe Hendricks, later affectionately known as Papa Joe. His office and home were open to us. I sought his sage advice on more than one occasion. And the dean spoke softly. However, he was a physically strong man. You needed only to ask one of the male students who had moved in a wave to cross College Street, headed for the women's dorm during a college blackout. Dean stood in the middle of the street with a baseball bat, swinging. No one dared challenge him. However, 2 or 3 guys did manage to slip into one of the dorms. They were outed, they were suspended. A banner was stretched over the doorway of one of the men's dorms with their names and the inscription, "Jesse Mercer loves you." One very cold morning, as I ran to make a dreaded 8 o'clock class, it may have been in this building, a diminutive woman said, "Stop." She ordered me to button up my coat that she'd seen open and flapping in the wind as I ran to class. She told me that my mother certainly would have insisted me to button up my coat, not wanting me to catch a cold. So this small in physical stature but commanding woman was Dr. Raymond, professor of Latin. I was never her student, but I guess you could say that she was not acting in her role as professor, but as I would later learn in law school, in loco parentis. In those years, without exception, every student had to take several English courses, one of which included writing a term paper. I was in Dr. Byron's class, and as he instructed, he regularly either puffed on his pipe or repacked the tobacco. All materials, research, notes, outlines, and drafts had to be produced for his review at pre-scheduled intervals. I had selected a topic that related to Edgar Allan Poe's method and use of descriptive literary devices. I could not find resources in the library that supported my practical view of his use of color and texture. I asked Dr. Byron to allow me to change my topic. After hearing my reason, his answer was no. I stayed with my topic, argued my position, and ultimately earned what was a rare grade for me, an A. My piano teacher, Mrs. Helen Rich, a Juilliard-trained piano virtuoso, instilled in me personal responsibility for preparation. One week I had not practiced as I should have done, but earlier that day before my lesson, I injured my right thumb tip, the scar is still there, while cleaning my assigned ROTC M1 rifle. I appeared for my lesson with my thumb liberally wrapped in bandages. I told her what had happened. She listened, but contrary to my expectation, she continued with the lesson. At the end of the lesson, she told me, "If you miss one day of practice, you know it. If you miss 2 days of practice, you and your close friends and associates will know it. If you miss 3 days of practice, everyone will know it." She never had to repeat that to me. Dr. Cox and Platt renewed my interest in politics and history. Dr. Cox demonstrated that Supreme Court opinions are created and developed in human, social, political, and historical contexts. And Dr. Platt regularly proved that students' subject knowledge could be effectively tested through his well-constructed multiple-choice tests. Now, Ambassador Walter Dowling, who was a Mercer graduate and had been ambassador to West Germany when the wall that has now been taken down first went up. He returned to Mercer as distinguished professor and taught foreign and international relations courses. Because of his international status and resulting connections, Ambassador Dowling attracted to Mercer many well-known international figures. On one occasion, our small class sat on the edge of our desk in a circle around former Secretary of State Dean Rusk, as he described in detail what had occurred in the Situation Room during the Cuban Missile Crisis. President Kennedy and his advisors were not at all sure that Khrushchev was even in charge at the Kremlin. Once the U.S. naval blockade of Cuba was in place, the Soviet command signaled and ordered its ships, then en route to Cuba, to stop. All had obeyed, save one. President Kennedy placed a pin in the map in the path of that ship and instructed that when the Russian ship reached his placement of the pin, it was to be blown out of the water. Secretary Rusk continued that for some reason, undivulged, the president moved the pin. It was later learned that the apparently belligerent ship had experienced communications problems and had not received the order to halt. Communication was reestablished, the order received, and finally the ship stopped. However, it had advanced beyond the president's initial pin placement before coming to a stop. Of course, we were breathless. There were professors identified to us by some as professors to be avoided. I never avoided a professor. From my view, my experiences and how I responded to them constituted life lessons that were fully a part of my education and preparation for life beyond college and law school. When I began my law career, this student of Dr. Byron never gave up an argument, position, or strategy simply because someone disagreed or criticized, and remembering Mrs. Rich's soft but clear declaration, my preparation was 110%. I never backed down in court because of who was on the bench or who was the opposing counsel. Dr. Cox, Dr. Platt whetted my appetite for a legal career. My classes with Ambassador Dowling and interaction with international luminaries made it clear to me that there were people, places, and important issues that were beyond my community, my state, and indeed beyond our nation's borders. The things I learned in classes from my professors and through interactions with them, in and out of class, created in me and many of my fellow students the quintessential Mercerian viewpoint, that we have a responsibility not only to ourselves but to others. We should not only care about ourselves, but we should care about others. My experiences at Mercer were mostly positive, but some were not. One would occasionally overhear the N-word, and I recall one of the Greek-sponsored Old South balls when one white male student dressed as Abraham Lincoln in blackface. The message was unavoidable, offensive, and hurtful. Disapproval and objections were expressed. And I must note, however, as I see my friends from the music department, that I pledged and was accepted in and admitted to membership to Phi Mu Alpha Symphonia, the music fraternity, without any incident or offense. Now, being socially conscious, I participated along with other Mercerians and members of the community in the Poor People's March as it came through Macon, and in Black student sit-ins demanding the hiring of Black faculty and the addition of African American studies to the curriculum. Now, at that time, we had many nationally known speakers, some who were highly controversial. They all spoke right here in this hall, then known as Chapel. Roger Mudd, news anchor for CBS News. Ralph Nader, then a consumer activist, credited with killing the Chevrolet Corvair, and later candidate for president. Dick Gregory, the black comedian and civil rights activist, Clarence Jordan, the fiery preacher of Koinonia, and poet Nikki Giovanni, just among a few. Now, Jane Fonda was probably the most controversial speaker. The Vietnam War was expanding, and she appeared to state her opposition. Her appearance created an uproar and much criticism from the community. Now, no speaker, including her, was spared tough questioning by students. Now, I must admit about Jane, I wasn't going to say this, but when she spoke here, after the program, she was back in the back of the stage, and I stood here and just stared at her. She kind of looked back in bewilderment and went about her business. Now, one of my greatest disappointments was having missed a presentation that my best friend at the time, Roscoe Woodruff, shared with me with great excitement. Alex Haley had appeared here while completing his blockbuster, Roots. Now, after missing Haley's speech, I kept a keen eye on the list of upcoming speakers. Now, there were also great entertainers, Gladys Knight and the Pips, the Beach Boys, and I mentioned the Beach Boys because the lead singer was leading a song, I think it was going to Kansas City, and he was carrying the microphone around the room, allowing members of the audience to sing. And it was very funny until he made the mistake of handing it to James Norman, who's the brother of the late opera singer Jesse Norman, and he could not take that mic back. Sadly, Otis Redding, a native Middle Georgian and local favorite and then rising superstar, was tragically killed the month before he was to headline here at homecoming. We, especially African American students, were crushed upon hearing the news of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Not everyone on campus was sad or cared to understand the impact that awful news had on us. I don't recall ever feeling more hurt, anger, and disappointment. In the fall of 1968, I engaged for the first time and last time in a presidential campaign. It was Humphrey versus Nixon. I did not support Mr. Nixon. Now, later in 1973, in November, I was a senior and the fourth African American in line to graduate from the Walter F. George School of Law, which was then right behind this building. In 1973, the law school was celebrating its 100th anniversary, and U.S. Representative Carl Vinson, considered father of the modern U.S. Navy and Mercer Law graduate, turned 90. The law school's 100th anniversary and Vinson's 90th birthday were jointly celebrated. Richard M. Nixon was the keynote speaker. Although I was not a Nixon supporter, there was simply no way I would not take my reserved seat as a member of the senior class. I guess it was my interest in history that was at work. The celebration with an overcapacity attendance was not without considerable controversy. However, it did, in my view, turn out to be historic. This building was surrounded with various groups at the time the event approached. There were two principal groups. One, the Young Republicans who waved their placards and shouted, "3 more years." Second, an opposing group, they waved their placards and shouted, "Impeach Nixon now." A third group ignored the event entirely and gathered some distance from the area and observed what they denominated the celebration of life. Now, one of my classmates remained outside of the building and told me that when Vincent arrived, the competing students stopped their chants and together sang "Happy Birthday, Uncle Carl," to make it clear that their actions were not directed at him. The president was not so accommodated, and he acknowledged as much during his speech. I sat up there in that balcony. This place was packed with senators, congressmen, national figures, and other famous and important people. The president announced the commissioning of the aircraft carrier USS Carl Vinson and presented a model to Vinson. Also present on the stage was then Governor Jimmy Carter, now a life trustee of Mercer. No one present could have guessed that in a matter of 8 or 9 months, Richard Nixon would become the first and only president of the United States to resign the office. In about 3 years, Governor Carter would be elected 39th president of the United States. They had both been present on that day, on this stage, and I had witnessed it. Of course, I wouldn't bore you and would not want you to bear all of my memories at Mercer. There are far too many. But I wanted to share a few with you and just mention just a few of the significant professors who had a great impact on my life. I now return to my mother. I came not only to recall, but to perceive the full meaning of my mother's answer to my naive and uninformed declaration so many years earlier that I was going to Mercer. Her response had been immediate, direct, and without qualification. Okay. Her response was affirmative. It was okay, without levity or sarcasm. There were no sorrowful, pitying words, disappointing explanations, excuses, or statement of impossibility. There was no but, or I need to explain some things to you. She had simply answered her little boy, okay. So years later, at the age of 18, as she helped me to move into the freshman's men's dorm on this campus in the fall of 1967, she looked at me and said with a smile, "You said you were going to Mercer." She, better than I, had appreciated and understood that my childhood aspiration, expressed so innocently so many years earlier, as bold and unrealistic as it was at the time, had indeed become my reality. I am a proud Mercerian, indeed a double bear. I love Mercer. Mercer is a part of me, and I'm a part of Mercer. I love Mercer not because Mercer has been or is perfect. It has not been, and it is not. No university or institution of higher learning is. As I thought about my time at Mercer, what I remembered and how I feel about Mercer, I also wondered about the recollections and feelings of my fellow African-American students who shared so many of my experiences. I called Sam Oney. We talked happily for a long period of time. Finally, I put the question to him, "How do you remember Mercer?" And he said in this still British accent and formal way of speaking, "I remember Mercer affectionately." Yes, Sam Oney loves Mercer too, and I am confident that we all do more or less because of the difference Mercer made in each of our lives. As human beings, we have the ability and capacity to grow, to learn, to improve, and to adapt. So do long-lived institutions like Mercer. Jesse Mercer and our other founders established a modest institution of higher learning in 1833. Our constitutional government was less than 50 years old at the time. The Mercer of today has undoubtedly exceeded anything our founders could have dreamed or perceived. Through the efforts of succeeding administrators, faculties, and students, Mercer has maintained and improved. Mercer has vastly expanded. Countless challenges, internally and externally, were faced and solved through the decades, resulting in the university that Mercer is today. What began as a small college in Penfield, Georgia, by 1967 when I arrived, consisted of the College of Liberal Arts, one of the nation's oldest law schools, and a school of pharmacy located in Atlanta. There was a single graduation ceremony held in Macon. Today, there are 12 schools and colleges with campuses in Macon, Atlanta, Savannah, and Columbus. My formerly small university has become a doctoral university with high research activity. Graduates of my law school served as Georgia Governor, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Georgia, Chief Justice of the Georgia Court of Appeals, President of the State Bar of Georgia, and President of the Young Lawyer Section, all at the same time. Mercer continues to perform and produce above her weight class. Racial integration was one of the major challenges Mercer faced. Integration directly involved and affected students like me. The solution and process, though imperfect, were more profound and genuine because the issue was addressed voluntarily. My fellow Mercerian, and on whose court I now sit, Judge and Mercer trustee William Augustus Bootle, who had ordered the desegregation of Georgia's flagship university, did not have to so address our alma mater. The integration of Mercer presented many challenges and difficulties, but I venture to say that those challenges and difficulties would have been much greater and more substantial but for Mercer's decision to address the matter voluntarily. There was substantial opposition. Will D. Campbell, in his book, The Stem of Jesse, chronicles much of the integration story of Mercer and Macon. But there were those at the time of integration who had attended Mercer generations earlier, who displayed and expressed the character that represents the best of Mercer. The impact of a Mercer education, and especially that of distinguished members of her faculties, are best expressed by her former students. Campbell includes in this book an example of such an impact in a letter to Dr. Harris. Dear Dr. Harris, you are on solid ground with both feet in this issue. Stand pat and fight it out. Your side is sure to win in the final. And what happens to a great cause is always more important than what happens to an individual sponsoring the right. The fine statements in your stand is the fact that you say there is a moral issue involved. To say that we should accept it because we just abide by the law is mighty poor support for integration, if it is a support at all. To say we must accept the Negro as a brother because we want to do so is better than most people are willing yet to do. This letter is likely due to the seed sown in English class at Mercer when I sat under Professor Carl Steed. He was a great advocate of the rights of the Negro even then, and did not wait until Sunday to say so. Sincerely, J.M. Etheridge, Jackson, Georgia, Mercer, 1911. Many of those who opposed the integration at Mercer predicted failure for the students, black students, and for Mercer. In their view, African Americans were unqualified for admission to Mercer, could not succeed as students at Mercer, and thus would lower Mercer's status as an institution of higher learning. Those predictions and views have been thoroughly debunked. Out of those first 4 classes came PhDs, professors, lawyers, doctors, judges, military field officers, administrators, community leaders, social workers, entrepreneurs, and other professionals. So long as the critical constituents of Mercer, that is, students, faculty, administrators, boards, alumni, and friends, continue to practice and exhibit those special qualities and character that make and have made Mercer special, and I'd say unique, Mercer will continue to lead, progress, and carry out its responsibility to educate all qualified students. It will make the changes and adjustments necessary, solve the issues it must, and thereby fulfill its important role and mission for generations yet to come. Somewhere today and in the future, there will be little boys and girls like you and like me, who will gleefully exclaim, "I'm going to Mercer." And importantly, there will be a great Mercer University here to welcome them. Thank you so much for listening and allowing me to share. And to all of you who are students, I wish the best of luck and good fortune to each of you in your studies and careers. In other words, go Bears.